She woke with a gasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A cold sweat slicked her skin. The room wasn't dark, not entirely. An unnatural, pulsing glow emanated from her window, bathing her room in shades of sickly green and yellow. Fear, primal and suffocating, coiled in her gut. She tried to scream, but her throat constricted, refusing to make a sound. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a metallic tang that made her want to gag. Something was terribly wrong. She tried to move, to throw off the covers and run, but her body refused to obey. A weight immense and invisible pinned her to the mattress. Panic swelled, choking her. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own bed. As her eyes adjusted to the eerie light, she made out the shapes by her window. Tall and skeletal, their forms shifted and rippled like heat waves rising from asphalt on a scorching summer day. They were here for her. Their eyes, large and black, snapped open, fixing on her with an unnerving intensity. They were cold, devoid of any emotion she could recognize. It was like being scrutinized by a predator, her every instinct screaming at her to flee. They moved closer, their elongated limbs gliding effortlessly across the floor. Their skin, if it could be called that, shimmered, an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of colors that made her head spin. They were beautiful and terrifying, a nightmare brought to life. Her fear reached a fever pitch. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up, to break free from this waking nightmare, but the cold dread that had seeped into her bones told her this was no dream. This was all too real. She felt a cold, clammy hand grip her ankle. Her eyes flew open, and she let out a whimper of terror. They were close now, their faces inches from hers. The stench of ozone and something else, something alien and indescribably foul, filled her nostrils. Panic seized her. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She thrashed against the invisible force that held her captive, but it was no use. She was utterly powerless, a puppet dangling from invisible strings. One of the figures leaned closer, its breath hot and fetid on her cheek. It spoke, but the sound that emerged was not language as she knew it. It was a series of clicks and whistles, a cacophony of noise that sent shivers down her spine. The room began to spin, the sickly green light intensifying until it was almost unbearable. Her vision blurred, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She felt herself slipping, her grasp on consciousness fading with each passing second. And then everything went black. She awoke to a feeling of weightlessness, her body suspended in a cold, sterile environment. Her head swam with dizziness, and her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Panic, raw and immediate, flooded her senses. Opening her eyes, she found herself strapped to a cold metallic table. Harsh, white light assaulted her eyes, forcing her to squint. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the pungent aroma of antiseptic. It smelled like a hospital, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Above her, strange metallic instruments hung from the ceiling, their surfaces gleaming ominously under the bright lights. She struggled against the restraints, but they held her fast, cold and unforgiving. Panic surged through her veins, a wild, desperate thing that threatened to consume her. She tried to scream, but only a dry, choked sob escaped her lips. Where was she? What did they want with her? The room was sterile, devoid of any human touch. The walls were a blinding white, broken only by the cold, metallic gleam of the instruments and the occasional panel of blinking lights. It felt like being trapped inside a giant, futuristic operating room. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of her captors, for any glimmer of hope. But the room was eerily empty, the silence broken only by the steady beep of a nearby machine. She was utterly alone, at the mercy of these things. As if summoned by her thoughts, a figure emerged from the shadows. tall and skeletal, its skin shimmering with that same unsettling iridescence. It moved with an unnerving grace. It approached the table, its large black eyes fixed on her with a chilling intensity. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced her. She thrashed against her restraints, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum, but her struggles were futile. She was completely at their mercy. The figure tilted its head, studying her with a detached curiosity that sent shivers down her spine. It reached out a long, slender finger, its touch sending a jolt of pain through her arm. She cried out, her voice raw and hoarse. Ignoring her distress, the figure began its examination. Cold, metallic instruments prodded and probed her flesh, their touch sending waves of nausea through her. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her abdomen, followed by a strange, pulling sensation. The figure worked quickly and efficiently, its movements precise and calculated. It was like watching a macabre surgeon perform a dissection, her body nothing more than a specimen to be dissected and analysed. Section 7. Agony and Despair. Time lost all meaning as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Waves of pain, sharp and agonizing, crashed over her, leaving her weak and trembling. She wept silently, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs. The experiments continued, each one more invasive and terrifying than the last. They took samples of her blood, her skin, even her bone marrow. They scanned her brain, bombarding her with images and sensations that left her reeling. She lost track of how long she spent on that cold, unforgiving table. Days, weeks, it felt like an eternity. Her body ached, her mind screamed for respite. She wanted nothing more than for the pain to stop, for this nightmare to be over. But the experiments continued, relentless and unforgiving. She was a prisoner in her own body, subjected to horrors she could never have imagined. Section 8. A stolen memory. Then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The figure stepped back, its task complete. It turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone once more in that cold, sterile room. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest. She lay there, trembling on the table, her mind numb with pain and exhaustion. She felt empty, hollowed out, as if they had taken something precious from her. Slowly, the restraints retracted, releasing her from their grip. She lay there for a moment, too weak to move, too terrified to even scream. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the shallow rasp of her own breath. As she lay there, fragments of memory flickered through her mind. Images, sounds, sensations, all jumbled and distorted. She saw flashes of the experiments, felt the searing pain of their instruments, heard the alien clicks and whistles of their language. Section 9. The Aftermath. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light began to fade. The room around her dissolved into a swirling vortex of darkness. She felt a sensation of falling, of being pulled backwards through a long, dark tunnel. And then she was back in her bed. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside her window. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of her air conditioner. She lay there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to catch her breath. Had it all been a dream? A horrific, vivid nightmare? She desperately wanted to believe that it was, but deep down she knew the truth. The memories were too real, too vivid to be dismissed as mere figments of her imagination. They had been here, and they had taken something from her, something she could never get back. Section 10. Living in Fear. She sat up in bed, her hand instinctively going to her abdomen. There was a dull, throbbing pain there, a constant reminder of what she had endured. She pulled back her hand, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to know, not yet. Fear, cold and suffocating, wrapped around her like a shroud. They'd taken her once, and they could easily take her again. She was a prisoner in her own home, living in constant fear of their return. She glanced at her window, her heart skipping a beat. The curtains were drawn, but she could have sworn she saw a flicker of movement outside, a fleeting glimpse of something tall and skeletal, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. She was not safe. She would never be safe. They were out there, watching, waiting, and one day they would come for her again.